fish talk here. Jay contacted me and asked if I could talk about smallmouth in northern Lake Michigan, and that's what I've kind of set up to do today. Just want to acknowledge, though, that there are great bass fisheries in the southern part of the lake as well. And I talked to like Ben Dickinson last night about this, and this is really an opportunity, I think, where we could collaborate a lot more on this particular topic. And a few years back, the Yellow Perch Task Group was disbanded, and not disbanded, but sort of the chart, we identified that we've kind of fulfilled our charge as the Perch Task Group, but we continued as the Inshore Fish Working Group, and with the idea that we'd kind of do some work on fish other than important nearshore fish other than yellow perch. And so in putting this together, it's really become apparent to me that there's lots of good information on smallmouth. They're an important fishery around the lake, and it's hopefully moving forward here we can do a little bit more work and collaboration around this species as well. I'm going to talk today, kind of relate smallmouth to the fish community objectives. Just real briefly, we've done this in State of the Lake reports before. I'll talk about current status of the populations and assessments that we're doing around the lake. Just really briefly touch on a few management issues that I think are important relative to bass, and then I don't have tons of time to like go into individual research projects, but there's a ton of research and assessment work going on around the lake, especially up in northern Lake Michigan. So I'm going to use the people who are doing that work to quickly kind of give you a little bit of a feel for what's going on. I thought a lot of times at these presentations, somebody pulls up an old picture and there's tons of fish around, and they think they use it to illustrate kind of how important this fishery used to be or how many fish there used to be around. So we do have that picture for bass. This is says down here 54 pounds of bass a morning's catch at Saugatuck, Michigan. So not northern Lake Michigan, but it's Lake Michigan. But really, bass are still abundant and a great fishery, but really we're talking about a completely different kind of fishery now with smallmouth bass in the lake, more catch and release kind of destination fishery in a lot of places. So the flavor of kind of how we approach this is a little different than how we used to approach it, but it's a neat kind of historical picture of bass as well. So just to relate to the fish community objectives, our nearshore fish objective is to maintain self-sustaining stocks of perch, walleye, bass, pike, catfish, and panfish. We do have yield objectives for yellow perch and walleye, not for bass. It's just that we have self-sustaining stocks. Smallmouth, and this is kind of text that we've drawn out of our State of the Lake reports, but they're kind of a minor component of the fishery, but as I mentioned, really important catch and release fishery, an important nearshore predator. So we've identified this in the past. We're talking about predator-prey ratios and models, and there's a few things that we don't always include in those models, and smallmouth might be one of those. A nearshore predator really, in terms of eating gobies and things like that, they're important. But really relatively little information compared to like perch, for example. So this, as I mentioned, an opportunity for us to collaborate a little bit more in the future maybe. Just to kind of show you our fish community objectives are framed in harvest. This is actually combined bass, pike, and panfish harvest is relatively stable through the last 20 years or so here. We're recognizing the importance in terms of management here as well. So this I was asked to talk about northern Lake Michigan, and so for example, Michigan DNR has been working on this zonal management process, and they are identified, bass are identified as important in the northern part of the lake. Also the kind of the pier fisheries in certain locations, and I'd continue this right around. As I mentioned, I talked to Ben, there are important fisheries down here. I know the Natural History Survey and the Illinois DNR have done quite a bit of work on some of the harbors down there in around Chicago. So it is a lake-wide fishery as well. So I'm going to go talk about sort of current status by going into just a couple of places where we have relatively longer term assessments for smallmouth bass. We do work in the Michigan DNR out of our office in Charlotte. We've been have relatively long-term data series at the Beaver Island Archipelago, Waugoshant's Point, and down in Grand Traverse Bay. And then just a little bit more kind of detail on those areas. We're doing sampling along that point that extends out into Lake Michigan from the Lower Peninsula. Quite a few sites around Beaver Island, and then sites down into Grand Traverse Bay, the east shore of Grand Traverse Bay here. Most of the data I'm going to be talking about is collected in these trap nets. So that's for those of you who haven't been around a trap net before. It's like a winged, large kind of. These are about 4 foot here, and then with usually about a 200-foot lead heading into shore there. So. And Wisconsin also has some longer-term assessment sites around the Door Peninsula and Sturgeon Bay. They have been sampling at Rowley Bay, Little Sturgeon Bay, and Sawyer Harbor. So I'm going to talk about three variables, just sort of abundance indices from these trap nets that I mentioned, the size structure in each of these areas, and then the recreational fishery in each of these areas. And all three of those variables indicate that we have really pretty healthy and healthy small bass populations in these areas. So this is from Little Sturgeon Bay and over in Wisconsin, their trap net catch. A little bit of a decline here, but probably not enough of a time series in that data set to really draw a trend. But the point here is, I'll show you in a minute what Michigan's are, but they're getting between 10 and 20 fish per net night in their surveys over in Wisconsin. This is some data from Michigan sites in the 50s here. This is some Waugoshant's Point data that we can maybe call this an unexploited population. The Beaver Island data is from the 70s here. Herb Lennon, working over at the CMU Biostation on Beaver Island, collected data. And then we've had a long-term data set here. This period potentially attributed to cormorant issues around Beaver Island, but we've in the recent years here seen good numbers in our surveys at Beaver Island, Waugoshant's Point here, and then the more recent data are from Grand Traverse Bay. The interesting thing here is we've really seen kind of comparable numbers in both the Michigan waters in northern Lake Michigan and the Wisconsin waters, about between 10 and 20 fish per net night in those areas. The length structure here, again, really indicating healthy populations. This is a time series of data from Beaver Island going back from the 70s all the way to the present. And you can see, especially in these recent years, our size limit for bass in Michigan is 14 inches, which is here, but we have really good numbers of bass over 14 inches in all these recent years, and really healthy population of large fish. In Sturgeon Bay, the same sort of thing here. There's 14 inches here, and you can see good part of the population is over 14 inches in those areas of the lake. So the recreational fishery is the third variable I'll talk about here. Again, indicating great populations here. So this is from Door County, and this is the smallmouth bass catch, up to 140,000 fish caught in some years, and effort, 160,000 hours of effort here. So just fish just for smallmouth bass. So really important fishery in this northern part of the lake. The same sorts of things we're seeing. This is just now Grand Traverse Bay data for Michigan, and catch of 50,000 fish in recent years in just in Grand Traverse Bay. We don't have a creel survey in our other sites in Beaver Island and Waugoshant's Point, but that's one area that we're trying to get some get some surveys done in that in those areas in the coming years. But just a really good, healthy catch and release fishery in this part of the lake. So just touch on a few of what we see as the management issues for smallmouth. The first is maintaining quality fisheries, and I think it's pretty clear we're doing that. We have we're often recognized kind of as the world's best in terms of smallmouth bass fishing. This is a notice about Sturgeon Bay in Wisconsin a few years back. They were on the list of 100 best bass lakes. They're typically, every year you'll see some stories in the big fishing magazines about Lake Michigan smallmouth bass. Great, this is a kid fishing on Travers Bay, and so it's a good, we have fishing clinics in Charlevoix for some of the local kids, and it's really, catching smallmouth bass is pretty easy and a good sort of introductory fishery for some of these kids as well. So this kid's obviously in a nice bass boat out in Grand Traverse Bay, but there's pier fisheries, as I mentioned, and a good introductory fishery for kids in the northern part of the lake here. Cormorant's the one we always talk about when we talk about smallmouth bass management, and we are people I think probably know the issues currently about cormorant control, but we are managing cormorant to the best of our ability, and we do in Michigan. I didn't get a chance really to talk to Wisconsin folks too much about what they're doing in this area, but we do have indices in Michigan that we're measuring to see what responses of fish populations are to cormorant control. And for bass, for example, this is one from Beaver Island. For bass, we want to maintain bass numbers here, adult bass numbers in where we can do population estimates. Now these aren't our netting surveys. These are actually mark and recapture estimates for the populations. We want to maintain adult bass numbers over 600 for this particular area around Beaver Island is one of our indices for how fish are responding to cormorant control. The other important management issue I feel around smallmouth bass is kind of the effect that these ecosystem changes have on smallmouth populations, and we heard quite a good talk, especially Steve yesterday, talking about some of these changes. But we really are seeing some effects of, for example, gobies. So we get lots of gobies in northern Lake Michigan now, and we have historical data showing mean length at age and condition, and the historical numbers are much reduced here. This is for the mean length at age and condition, and the recent data, the growth rates of bass in northern Lake Michigan are among the best in the nation, really, because, in large part, because of the introduction of gobies as a food source. So they're having a positive effect here. We are concerned about production of young fish in these areas, potentially negative effects of some of these invasives. And also, through these surveys, we're getting a good picture of where the smallmouth bass, what the fish community looks like in terms of smallmouth bass abundance. And so we were able to here look at the percentage of the population made up of different fish species. In the past, smallmouth was a relatively minor component of the population, and in recent years, greater than 90% of the fish that we collect are smallmouth bass up there. So we're seeing ecosystem changes and an important management consideration, we feel, that are closely tied to smallmouth bass. So I want to finish up. I mentioned there's lots and lots of great work going on. I feel like this is an area that we're just exciting to be involved with. And so I want to just talk quickly about a few of the people that are involved with this. I want to start out, Carl Latta was a research biologist in Michigan and became the director of our research section. And he's kind of what I'd call the father of smallmouth bass research and smallmouth bass knowledge up there in the northern part of the lake. So he's, as his PhD thesis was life history of smallmouth at Wagashuns Point. He did lots of work on smallmouth bass regulations as well, and lots of what we're doing now is the basis of that is from Carl's work. This is Carl back in the 50s doing smallmouth work. He was actually my advisor at University of Michigan, so this is how I remember him sitting in the office at IFR. But he continued work through his retirement, and this is him on the plus side, 80 years old, pulling a seine in the Huron River, I think. And some of you may recognize Dave Swank too, as a steelhead researcher, but Carl was responsible for the Alice of Michigan fishes when he was in his late 70s or 80s. So he's, as I said, he's kind of a lot of the basis for what we're doing up here now is formed from Carl's work at Waugoshance Point. But lots of other people. I want to just really quickly go through. There's some graduate students that we can really thank for a lot of important information. Mark Kamick did work on smallmouth bass movement and population estimates and the fish community interactions that I mentioned. Kevin Dvorsky did work on habitat suitability for bass, both in this area, and then he's actually developed a model, a lake-wide model of habitat suitability for smallmouth bass. Emily did a lot of work on bass growth rates and also updated Carl's work at the Waugoshance Point area. Mike was involved with kind of looking at the effects of cormorant on those populations. Chuck is working on contaminant issues surrounding smallmouth bass in northern Michigan. Troy Zorn's a biologist with Michigan DNR, is involved in collaborations with looking at bass genetics, as well as the forage structure and using stable isotopes to look at the forage interactions up in that part of the lake. Tracy's a professor at CMU that we worked with closely over the last 15 years or so, and she's actually had graduate students, undergraduate students. It's a great training place for them, but they've also done work on early life history of bass in the Beaver Island and Waugoshance Point areas, and looking at some of those habitat effects that might be important for our environmental principles group. And then lots of work in Wisconsin as well. This is Tim Kreff, who's I thought had retired, but I talked to Scott Hansen, and that retirement rumor may not be quite so true. It sounds like Tim's keeps coming back and helping them out all the time. But Tim's really knowledgeable about bass over there. But Tim and Scott and Tammy in Green Bay have lots of projects going on over there as well. So again, just that was a 2 or a minute and a half or 2 minute overview of what's really really vital and interesting bunch of work that's going on smallmouth bass. So somebody yesterday said we should quit doing our spring lake trout surveys and doing more like focus on the fall work in November when the ice is on the boat and the waves are rolling over the bow and all that stuff. I'm going to close today by advocating that we do more smallmouth bass studies when in these beautiful places where it's sunny and warm in the middle of summer and you get sunsets like this. So that's my closing remark.